Welcome to the deep dive. You've requested we take a look at a case, and it's undeniably tough to stomach. The Moors murders. It's a truly dark chapter in British history. And, while it's easy to want to just turn away from that kind of horror, understanding what happened and maybe even more importantly, why it happened, it feels important, don't you think?
Absolutely. This case, for all its darkness, it offers a chilling but crucial glimpse into the minds of, those who commit these kinds of acts. And maybe, just maybe by understanding it, we can better equip ourselves,
What?
to recognize and hopefully prevent similar tragedies from happening.
Yeah, you're right. Sometimes facing the darkness head on, it's the only way to learn from it. So for you listening out there, we're going to carefully unpack this whole thing. We're drawing on all the research and expert analysis you've been kind enough to provide. And look, we're aiming for understanding here, not sensationalism. We're going to start, I think, by setting the scene right. Back in 1960s Britain, a time of, what was it? Massive social change, yet against this backdrop of change and optimism, the Moors murders, they struck a chord of fear that really resonated deeply. Why was that, do you think?
Well, imagine this. It's a time of optimism, like you said, of progress. The future is, it's looking bright. And suddenly children begin to disappear. Not just disappear, but, they turned up much later in shallow graves on this desolate moor. It just sent shockwaves through the country. These weren't just crimes. They were seen as a crack in the very foundation of society, a terrifying breach of the expected order.
It's interesting you say that because it does feel like this case, it tapped into something primal, something beyond just the horror of the acts themselves. And at the heart of this darkness were Brady and Myra Hindley. Now, from the materials you sent Brady, he seems like he was troubled from the start, wouldn't you say?
Yes. Brady's upbringing, it was incredibly difficult. Born in Glasgow in '38, he experienced neglect, violence, a real lack of stability. And what's fascinating and frankly disturbing is how this early trauma, it seemed to intertwine with a fascination, even from a young age, with themes of sadism, of control. We're not just talking about a tough childhood here. We're talking about a young boy drawn to literature about violence, Nazi ideology, themes that suggested a much deeper disturbance.
So for you listening, imagine this. It's not just that he experienced hardship, it's that he sought out these dark materials, almost like he was, I don't know, trying to make sense of his own internal world through them.
Exactly. And this wasn't just theoretical. His criminal behavior, it began early too. Petty theft escalating to violence, landing him in juvenile detention by his teens. By the time he met Myra Hindley in 1961, he was working as a stock clerk. And it seems he was already fantasizing about enacting the violence and domination he'd been consuming in his thoughts.
And Hindley, she was a local Manchester girl, right? What was her life like before Brady?
Yes, that's right. Born in 1942. On the surface, her childhood appeared, more normal. A working-class upbringing, not without its difficulties, but nothing that immediately pointed towards, the horrors she'd become involved in. Before Brady, she was seen as quiet, even unremarkable, really.
And yet, according to this biography you've highlighted, their first meeting while she was working as a typist at the same firm, it had a profound impact on her.
It did. It really did. It was almost a textbook case of coercion and manipulation.
Yeah.
Brady, with his intelligence, this brooding intensity and his warped worldview, he completely captivated Hindley. She became infatuated and, tragically, complicit. This wasn't a partnership of equals. This was Brady, the manipulator,
Yeah.
recognizing in Hindley someone he could mold, someone who would not only tolerate but participate in his darkest fantasies.
And that's where this deep dive, it takes an even darker turn because their relationship, it wasn't just about, twisted affection, was it? It became the catalyst for the nightmare that became the Moors murders.
Yeah, catalyst. That's a good word for it. Because while their relationship, it was clearly toxic, it was the actions they took together that are they're truly horrifying. And those actions were tragically directed at 5 young victims.
5 lives cut short. 5 families forever shattered. And it's important, even as we delve into, the psychology of the perpetrators, to never forget the human cost of their crimes.
Absolutely. And to truly understand, I think, the calculated nature of those crimes, it's helpful maybe to look for the patterns in how they selected and abducted their victims, rather than, just treating each case in isolation.
That makes sense. So rather than walking through each victim chronologically, which, as you pointed out before we started, it can start to feel repetitive. Maybe we can use the insights you've pulled from all your research to illuminate the methods behind the madness, so to speak.
Precisely. For example, both Pauline Reed, their first victim, and John Kilbride, their second. They were lured in with offers of help. Pauline, just 16, she was on her way to a dance when Hindley, she claimed she'd lost a glove on the moors and asked for help finding it.
It's chilling, this lost glove tactic. For you listening, imagine the scene. A seemingly harmless request for help, played on a young girl's good nature. It's a stark reminder of how easily children, especially in those days, they were taught to trust adults, to be helpful.
Right, and it speaks volumes, I think, about their premeditation. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was planned, rehearsed, almost. They knew exactly the kind of vulnerability they were looking for.
And tragically, they found it again with John Kilbride, just 12 years old, abducted from a busy market.
Again, the pretense of help. They offered him a ride home, knowing that, well, for a young boy, especially in the early evening when it was already getting dark, accepting a lift from adults, it wouldn't have seemed out of the ordinary. It highlights how easily someone can seem unthreatening, how the most mundane interactions can mask these sinister intentions.
It's terrifying, really. It makes you question every interaction, every seemingly harmless encounter.
And that unease, that erosion of trust, that's one of the most, I think you could say, insidious legacies of this case. But it's important to remember that while we can, and I'd argue should, learn from these tragedies, we shouldn't let that fear paralyze us.
That's a really important point. So how does this pattern of preying on vulnerability, of using this deception, how does it manifest in their later crimes?
Well, even in the cases of Keith Bennett and Leslie Ann Downey, who were both abducted from public places, Keith from a street near his grandmother's house and Leslie Ann from a festive fairground, there's evidence to suggest that Brady and Hindley had been watching them, selecting them based on their perceived vulnerability. They were looking for children who were alone, or at least appeared to be alone. Children who might be more likely to trust a stranger or be swayed by a seemingly harmless request.
So even when they weren't using an outright ruse, they were still relying on this element of manipulation,
Yes.
of exploiting the innocence of their victims.
Exactly. And this pattern of, you could say, calculated cruelty,
Yeah.
it continued right up until their final victim, Edward Evans.
And Edward's murder, it's unique, isn't it? Unlike the others, it took place in front of a witness. This wasn't out on the moors, but in the home that Brady shared with Hindley. It feels, I don't know, significant, this shift from, relative secrecy to what almost feels like, arrogance.
It is a chilling thought, but yes, I think that's a valid observation.
Yeah.
Edward, who was 17, he became their final victim in October of 1965. And the witness you mentioned, David Smith, he was actually Hindley's brother-in-law. He'd been invited over by Brady, and, he walked in on a scene of, unimaginable brutality.
Can you imagine, for those listening, being in Smith's shoes, invited to someone's home only to be confronted with that level of violence? And
Yeah.
and what we learned from the testimonies is that Smith, he was utterly horrified by what he witnessed, the cold, calculated brutality of it all. He went to the police the very next morning.
He did, and thankfully so. It took immense courage for him to come forward, knowing the potential repercussions. His testimony, though, proved absolutely vital in cracking the case wide open.
Yeah. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What would have happened if Smith hadn't spoken up? Would there have been, more victims? It's a sobering thought.
It is, but let's not forget that, once the police had their suspicions, the evidence they uncovered, it was overwhelming. Photographs of the victims, including those taken on Saddleworth Moor, and most chillingly, that audio recording of Leslie Ann Downey's torture. It left no room for doubt about their guilt.
You're right to emphasize that recording. Just imagine being on that jury, hearing, a child's terrified pleas, her cries for mercy. The public was absolutely gripped by this trial. And that evidence, I think, in particular, it painted a horrifyingly clear picture of what those children went through.
It's important, I think, to acknowledge the impact this case had, not just on those directly involved, but, on society as a whole. It shook people to their core. Suddenly, the unimaginable, it felt terrifyingly real. And the boogeyman, so to speak, wasn't, some mythical creature, but two seemingly ordinary individuals living amongst us.
And the trial in 1966, it ultimately resulted in both Brady and Hindley being found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. While Brady remained imprisoned until his death in 2017, Hindley's case, as you know, it took a different turn.
Yes. Hindley, she later claimed that she was manipulated by Brady. and she expressed remorse for her actions. But public sentiment, understandably, I think, remained largely unconvinced. There were numerous campaigns against her release, really highlighting the deep-seated anger and fear that she continued to evoke.
This case, even after all these years, it continues to fascinate, but also, well, horrify. So as we reach the end of our deep dive here, I'm left wondering what can we learn from all of this? Is there a takeaway, something we can apply to our own lives, or is it just a grim reminder of the capacity, I guess, for human cruelty?
It's a question that, well, it haunts everyone who delves into this case, and I wish I had a simple answer for you. But perhaps if there's anything to glean from this darkness, it's the importance of vigilance, of trusting your gut instincts and speaking up, like David Smith did when something it just doesn't feel right. Because sometimes that act of courage of confronting the darkness, it's all that stands well, between more lives being lost.
That's a powerful thought to end on. And to you listening, thank you for joining us on this difficult but important journey. Remember, understanding the darkness, however unsettling, sometimes it's the first step in preventing it from happening again.